Imagine, right? Imagine trying to run a state-of-the-art, hyper-advanced 2026 artificial intelligence program on, well, on a computer from 1995.
Oh, man. That sounds like a nightmare.
Right. You've got this incredibly complex software, and it's capable of processing millions of data points a second, but you are trying to force it through like a dusty dial-up modem.
Yeah, and a processor that probably struggles to even open a basic spreadsheet.
Exactly. You don't just get a slow program in that scenario, you get a catastrophic system failure. I mean, the hardware literally cannot handle the reality of the software.
Right. It freezes, it crashes, and ultimately, it just becomes completely useless.
Yes. And that fundamental incompatibility, that massive, unavoidable collision between the speed of the modern world and the creeping, paralyzed hardware of the state, is the core of what we are digging into today.
It is a phenomenal way to visualize the crisis outlined in our materials for this deep dive because, we aren't just talking about a sluggish government here.
No, not at all.
We're talking about a systemic realization that the current hardware of the British political state might be fundamentally incapable of processing the demands of the 21st century.
Which is a huge claim.
It is. And what is truly captivating about the sources we have on the table today is who is delivering this diagnosis and, crucially, who is enthusiastically agreeing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We have a genuinely fascinating and honestly somewhat baffling puzzle to piece together for you today.
We really do.
We are looking at a stack of incredibly charged, highly polarized sources. On the table, we have a passionate political essay titled The Tony Blair Witch Dick Project.
Quite the title.
Yeah, right? And we also have an AI-generated synthesis exploring Tony Blair's recent 10-point plan, along with some excerpts detailing that massive 5,700-word blueprint for what Blair is calling the radical center.
And our mission for this deep dive, for those of you listening, is to understand the deep, really boiling frustration currently directed at Keir Starmer's Labour government.
That's the goal.
Right. We are going to unpack that by examining an incredible political irony. We're looking at why traditional populist critics of the political establishment are suddenly using a 10-point technocratic plan from Tony Blair, of all people, as a weapon against the current prime minister.
Now, before we get into the mechanics of this, I really need to set some very clear ground rules for you.
Yes, very important.
The sources we are analyzing today contain highly charged, heavily polarized political rhetoric. So I want to be crystal clear here. We're not taking sides. And we're absolutely not endorsing the viewpoints of these authors.
Absolutely not.
Our job today is strictly to impartially report on the ideas contained in this material, to unpack the arguments being made, and to help you understand the temperature of the current political discourse.
Exactly. We are here to look at the mechanics of the frustration, to understand how these arguments are constructed, not to validate or condemn the politics behind them.
Precisely. We are essentially analyzing the anatomy of a political pressure cooker.
Yeah, and to understand why the pressure is building so rapidly under the current administration, you really have to look at the fuel being thrown on the fire.
Right.
And strangely enough, the primary fuel source right now seems to be, well, a 5,700-word essay from a former prime minister.
Which brings us to the central irony of this whole situation.
Yeah.
I mean, how on earth did Tony Blair, a man explicitly described in our own sources as an architect of the very political class that ordinary people are furious with, become the voice of the frustrated taxpayer?
It's wild.
It is. Let's look at the essayist we are pulling from. The sheer shock in their writing is just palpable. They write, and I'm quoting here, "I never thought I would live to see the day when Tony Blair made more sense than anyone sitting in Downing Street."
What's fascinating here is the psychological dynamic at play.
Break that down a bit.
Well, you have to understand the Nixon goes to China principle here. If a standard conservative politician or, a populist commentator criticizes Keir Starmer's government for being bloated and inefficient,
It's just easily dismissed.
exactly, it's dismissed by the establishment as routine partisan noise. But the author of this essay recognizes Tony Blair as the high priest of the modern political class.
Yeah, the ultimate insider.
Right. This is the man who arguably built the modern administrative state, who expanded the public sector, who championed the very globalized consensus that populist critics have been fighting against for decades.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the author views Blair as the creator of the exact political class that they feel has spent the last 20 years talking down to them.
Yes, exactly. So when that figure, the architect of the system himself, releases a comprehensive 10-point plan saying essentially the state is too big, it's too slow, it's suffocating growth, and it needs a radical, immediate overhaul.
It hits like a ton of bricks.
It hits with the force of an earthquake. For the essayist, agreeing with Tony Blair is, it's deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah, it contradicts their entire political identity.
But they are forced to agree. Because Blair's is openly diagnosing the systemic rot that they've been screaming about for years. It validates their anger precisely because the validation comes from the establishment's most successful figure.
It's like, think about it like this. It's like complaining for years about how terrible a restaurant has become.
Okay, I like this.
Right. And then the retired head chef, the guy who originally wrote the menu, walks in, tastes the food, and says, "You're right. The food is completely inedible now."
Yes.
It just completely validates the customer's anger.
That's a perfect analogy.
But let's hold on a second and look at the mechanics of what he is actually proposing in this radical center blueprint. Because it's not just a vague call for, like, better management.
No, it is highly, highly specific.
He's talking about reorganizing the entire apparatus of government around the artificial intelligence revolution. He wants to create what he calls a reimagined state.
And the mechanics of this reimagined state involve a significantly smaller bureaucratic footprint, lower taxes, and the aggressive removal of obstacles to business.
Which is exactly what the populist right has been asking for. But the specific focus on AI is the crucial mechanism here, isn't it?
It really is. Blair isn't arguing for a smaller state out of some traditional ideological desire for small government.
Right, he's not a libertarian.
Exactly. He is arguing for it out of raw mathematical necessity. His premise, as outlined in the synthesis, is that the AI revolution is going to move at a speed that traditional government bureaucracies simply cannot comprehend.
Let alone regulate or actually utilize.
Right. If your government relies on committee meetings, endless consultation periods, and sprawling departments just to make a basic decision, it will be crushed by the sheer velocity of technological change.
So to go back to our dial-up analogy from the start, Blair is saying you have to completely gut the hardware of the state and rebuild it, or you simply won't survive the software update.
That's exactly it.
And this is where I want to push back a little on the essayist's reaction, because is the author of this critique actually agreeing with Blair's technocratic vision for an AI-driven future?
That's a good point.
Or are they just, latching on to the side effects of Blair's plan, meaning they just like the part where taxes go down and regulations are slashed?
That is a very sharp distinction to make, and the text suggests it's absolutely the latter. The author doesn't suddenly believe Tony Blair is the savior of the working class.
Right.
The author is experiencing a massive convergence of interests. Blair wants to gut the bureaucracy to make room for AI and secure macroeconomic growth.
And the taxpayer?
The taxpayer, as represented by the essayist, wants to gut the bureaucracy because they are just tired of paying exorbitant taxes for terrible public services.
So they're arriving at the exact same conclusion, that the current state apparatus is bloated and broken, but from two entirely different starting points.
Exactly. It's a marriage of convenience. But what makes it so lethal for Keir Starmer is that it creates a massive pincer movement.
Oh, I see what you mean.
You have the technocratic elite telling the government they are too slow and bureaucratic to survive the future, and you have the working class taxpayers telling the government they are too incompetent to manage the present.
Wow. Yeah, that is a tight spot. And that leads us straight into how these sources view the stark reality of the current administration.
Yes, because if Blair's theoretical vision is this hyper-efficient, tech-driven, streamlined, reimagined state, the sources paint the actual reality of Starmer's government as the polar opposite.
Right. The defining accusation in these texts is that this administration is behaving like a management team hired to supervise decline.
Supervised decline. That is just a brutal phrase.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because it implies a total absence of agency. It implies that the people in charge don't actually believe they can fix anything.
Right, like their only goal is to make sure the collapse is appropriately filed and documented in triplicate.
Exactly. It implies a philosophy of managed stagnation. The critique argues that the current government isn't trying to build the hyper-fast engine Blair is talking about.
No. Instead, they are just trying to aggressively micromanage the resting 1995 hardware.
Putting more and more administrative weight on a system that is already buckling. And the primary mechanism they use to do this is taxation.
Which sets up the massive paradox that dominates the second section of our sources.
Okay, let's dig into that paradox, because It is the source of so much of the visceral anger in this essay.
Hmm.
The text states that the country is currently taxed more heavily than it has been in decades.
Right.
Now, theoretically, high taxation is supposed to buy you high-functioning public services,
Right.
right? I mean, the basic social contract is you give the state a massive chunk of your labor, and the state gives you security, infrastructure, and efficiency.
That is the theoretical model, yes. But the reality presented in the text is a complete collapse of that contract.
Yeah.
The author lists what the taxpayer is actually getting in return for this historically high tax burden, and it's a relentless litany of state failure.
They point to broken roads filled with potholes,
Broken borders,
broken policing where burglaries aren't even investigated,
broken courts with massive backlogs.
broken housing markets, and fundamentally, just broken infrastructure across the board.
And I want to focus on the why here.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the tax revenue is at historic highs, where is the money actually going?
That's the billion-dollar question.
The sources are incredibly focused on this misallocation of funds. The author points out that the public is constantly subjected to this narrative of austerity when it comes to basic domestic needs.
Right, we are told there is no money for pensioners,
No money to support farmers.
no money for British industry.
No money to properly equip the defense forces.
But then, and this is where the text gets incredibly heated, there magically always seems to be an infinite supply of money for specific non-productive sectors of the state.
The author specifically targets the proliferation of consultants, diversity departments, and the vast network of quangos.
And let's be clear about the functional role of a quango here. For those listening who might not be familiar with the inner workings of UK bureaucracy, a quango is a quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organization.
Right. And the essayist isn't just mad at the acronym. They are pointing to these quasi-autonomous bodies as a deliberate mechanism used by the political class to outsource risk and avoid accountability.
Exactly. The critique of quangos in these sources is deeply structural. When a government creates an arm's-length administrative body and funds it with billions of taxpayer pounds, they're essentially creating a democratic buffer.
Yes, exactly. If something goes wrong, if a service fails or money is completely wasted, the politicians can just point to the quango and say, well, they are an independent body, it's not a direct ministerial failure.
It's an accountability shield.
The essayist views this as the ultimate betrayal. The taxpayer is forced to fund these unelected administrative black holes, getting zero service in return, while the politicians who created them just wash their hands of the consequences.
And this structural misallocation is what fuels the concept of two-tier Keir that the AI synthesis brings up. Break down the mechanics of this two-tier system for me, based on the text. Who exactly is in Tier 1 and who is in Tier 2?
According to the synthesis of these critiques, Tier 2 consists of the ordinary, law-abiding taxpayers.
Right.
These are the people who go to work, pay their taxes on time, follow the regulations, and just try to build a life. The perception in the text is that this tier is actively penalized.
Right, they are squeezed for every penny.
Their businesses are strangled by red tape, and their local services are gutted. Tier 1, on the other hand, consists of the bureaucratic blob and the ideological priorities of the state.
So the consultants, the administrative bloat.
Exactly. And the massive uncosted systems, like the broken asylum processing network, that absorb billions of pounds without delivering any tangible benefit to the people actually funding the state.
So if you're in Tier 2, you are basically treated like an ATM for Tier 1.
That's a good way to put it.
You're expected to produce the wealth, hand it over, and expect absolutely nothing in return. And when you complain that the roads are crumbling and you can't get a doctor's appointment, you are just met with a wall of excuses.
The displacement of blame is highlighted as a chronic symptom of this supervising decline.
The author literally catalogs the excuses. I mean, it's like a greatest hits album of political deflection.
Yeah, they blame the Tories, naturally.
They blame Brexit.
They blame global macroeconomic conditions.
They blame social media algorithms for making people angry.
They even blame the public themselves for having the wrong attitudes.
It is literally everyone and anyone's fault except the people who actually hold the levers of power.
But we have to ask here, is this purely incompetence, as the author suggests, or is it just systemic inertia?
What do you mean?
Well, Keir Starmer inherited a massively complex, already strained state apparatus. Changing the trajectory of a modern state is like trying to turn a supertanker. Is the essayist demanding the impossible by expecting immediate, visible returns on taxation in an era of global economic instability?
I see where you're going, but I think the essayist would argue that the supertanker defense is exactly the kind of excuse they are sick of hearing. If the state is too big and slow to turn, then that just proves Blair's point. You have to dismantle the supertanker and build speedboats.
That's a fair counterpoint.
The frustration stems from the fact that the government isn't trying to change the vessel. They are just demanding the passengers row harder while the ship takes on water.
Yeah.
And nowhere is that water rising faster, and nowhere is the anger more acute than when the sources tackled the issues of borders and the justice system.
This brings us to Section 3 of our analysis, which is undeniably the most volatile and emotionally charged element of the source material.
Absolutely.
And again, it's anchored to Tony Blair's blueprint. Point 8 of Blair's plan explicitly calls to resolve immigration system deficiencies.
Okay.
He advises the government to take aggressive measures to halt illegal immigration while heavily targeting legal migration.
Which is astounding because for decades, the consensus in the globalized political center, which Blair himself helped build, was that high migration was an unalloyed economic good.
Right.
For him to pivot and say, no, this system is deficient and needs aggressive halting, gives massive cover to the populist critiques.
It does.
And the essayist uses this runway to unleash a devastating financial argument about the cost of the current system. Let's look at the specific metric they focus on regarding the prison system.
The sources cite a highly specific, staggering financial statistic. They state that keeping a single foreign criminal in a British prison costs the taxpayer over £54,000 every single year.
Wait, £54,000?
Over $54,000 every single year.
That's insane. Let's actually unpack the mechanics of that £54,000, because it isn't just about 3 meals a day in a cell. The text forces you to look at the opportunity cost.
Yes.
The median annual salary in the UK is somewhere around £35,000.
Right.
That means you have millions of people waking up in the dark, grinding through 40-hour work weeks, dealing with inflation, dealing with their own cost of living. And an entire year's worth of their income tax isn't even enough to cover half the cost of housing one foreign national who committed a crime in their country.
The mechanics of that £54,000 figure involve a massive bureaucratic tale. It's not just the physical incarceration.
Right.
It is the legal aid, the endless appeals processes, the human rights tribunal costs, the translation services, and the administrative bloat required to manage a system that is essentially paralyzed by its own legal complexities.
And the essayists' demand in response to this math is incredibly blunt. They write, deport them, send them home, let their own countries carry the burden.
Yeah.
The rhetorical question they pose is one that clearly resonates deeply with the public. Why should we put up with other countries' rejects? But here's where we hit a massive structural wall. I have to push back on the essayist's simplicity here. You can't just put people on a plane. I mean, there's a complex web of international human rights law, the European Convention on Human Rights, and domestic legal frameworks that make deportation incredibly difficult, especially to countries deemed unsafe.
Is the author just ignoring the legal reality of the modern world?
Well, the author isn't necessarily ignoring it. They are utterly rejecting it.
Rejecting the laws themselves.
Yes. The essayist's perspective is that these international treaties and human rights frameworks have been weaponized to create a suicide pact for the nation state.
Wow.
They view these legal frameworks as the ultimate Tier 1 luxury belief. The politicians and human rights lawyers who champion these complex, paralyzing laws don't live in the communities dealing with the fallout of imported crime.
Ah, I see.
The author's point is that if the laws of the country force the working class to pay £54,000 a year for a foreign criminal instead of fixing local hospitals, then the laws are inherently immoral and they must be torn up.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. What happens when a regular person, a Tier 2 taxpayer, points this out?
What happens when they look at their crumbling local high street and say, I really don't think we should be spending billions processing and housing people who broke into the country, and I definitely don't want to pay £54,000 for a foreign criminal.
According to the sources, when a citizen points out that basic mathematical and social reality, the government's response is not to engage in a policy debate.
Right.
The response is to deploy a label. The text describes this as the great trick of the political class, the deliberate branding of opposition as extremism.
This is such a critical point, the weaponization of the far right.
Exactly. The sources argue that if a citizen expresses a desire for lower migration, or if they question whether a small island nation can absorb endless population growth while its housing and infrastructure collapse.
They aren't met with facts or counter-arguments.
No, they are immediately reflexively labeled far-right, divisive, or extremist.
Right.
The author posits that this is not an accident. It is a highly cynical, calculated communications strategy designed to silence legitimate debate by framing basic national self-preservation as a moral failing.
So what's the broader implication here for public discourse? Because it seems to me that if you stretch a definition too far, it just completely snaps.
Yes.
If you use the exact same phrase, far right, to describe a literal neo-Nazi who wants to destroy democracy and a 55-year-old plumber who just wants secure borders and foreign criminals deported, the term loses all of its diagnostic power.
It creates a linguistic inflation that is incredibly dangerous for a democracy. The sources suggest that the label has completely lost its power to shame or warn the public.
It's just a buzzword now.
It has simply become a synonym for someone the government disagrees with. And when the government uses the heaviest moral artillery it has to attack ordinary people raising basic mathematical concerns, it doesn't silence them.
No, of course not.
It breeds a profound, quiet, and deeply radicalizing resentment. It communicates to the public that the government doesn't just disagree with them, it actively despises them.
It's the ultimate gaslighting. You are forced to pay for a system that actively works against your interests, and when you complain, you are told you are an evil person.
Exactly.
Let me give you an analogy for how the text frames this. Imagine you are forced, by law, to pay a massive monthly subscription fee to a security company.
Okay.
But instead of guarding your house, the security company uses your money to house, feed, and provide top-tier legal defense for the guy who keeps breaking into your garage.
Oh, wow.
Right? And when you call the company to say, hey, I'd like to cancel my subscription, this makes absolutely no sense, the customer service rep calls you an extremist and threatens to have you arrested for hate speech.
That is a brutally effective analogy.
That is the level of absurdity the essayist has tried to convey here.
And that absurdity, that feeling of being trapped in an irrational, punitive system, flows directly into the next major financial drain identified in the sources.
Which is?
From the £54,000 a year cost of foreign prisoners, the conversation naturally shifts to the ballooning welfare bill, because the underlying mechanism of frustration is the exact same.
The state taking money from the productive economy to fund a system that the sources argue is actively destroying society.
Yes. And once again, Tony Blair provides the structural critique that empowers the populist anger.
Blair's plan again.
Yes. Point 6 of Blair's 10-point plan is an explicit call to overhaul the welfare system. He suggests that the government must restructure and reduce the benefits bill.
Okay.
He even goes so far as to suggest that Keir Starmer's Labour government should actively cooperate with the Conservative Party to form a cross-party consensus to push this through.
That detail cannot be overstated. A former Labour Prime Minister is telling a sitting Labour Prime Minister that the welfare state has become such a catastrophic liability that he needs to work with his sworn political enemies to dismantle parts of it.
The scale of the crisis that would prompt that kind of advice is staggering.
And the text gives us the specific metric that illustrates that scale. The author points out that the British state is currently on track to spend more money on incapacity and disability benefits than it spends on national defense.
What is just hard process?
Let's sit with that for a second. We live in a world where war is returning to Europe, where global instability is at a peak, and a major Western power is spending more taxpayer money funding people not to work than it is spending to defend its own borders and its own citizens from literal military threats.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources are describing a deeply destructive, self-perpetuating economic cycle.
How so?
The author makes a philosophical argument about the nature of the welfare state. They acknowledge that a safety net is theoretically meant to be exactly that. A net to catch you when you fall, to help you recover, and to bounce you back into the productive economy.
Right, a temporary measure.
But the reality, according to this critique, is that the safety net has morphed into a permanent hammock. It has become a permanent lifestyle funded by shrinking numbers of taxpayers.
A permanent lifestyle. That's a devastating indictment of the policy design. But again, I need to challenge the premise here, just to be balanced.
Okay, go ahead.
Are we absolutely sure this is entirely a failure of policy? What about demographic destiny? Britain has a massive aging population. As people get older, sickness increases, disability increases, and naturally, the welfare bill goes up.
Yeah.
Is the essayist unfairly blaming the government for the simple biological reality that the baby boomers are aging out of the workforce?
The sources anticipate that defense, actually, and they reject it by pointing to the specific nature of the claims. The explosion isn't just in state pensions for the elderly.
It's not.
No, the explosion is in working-age people claiming incapacity benefits, often for mental health or vague, unquantifiable conditions.
Ah.
The author argues that this isn't a demographic inevitability. It is a behavioral shift heavily incentivized by state policy. If the state makes it economically viable, or sometimes even economically preferable, to claim incapacity rather than take a minimum wage job, a significant portion of the population will rationally choose the benefits.
And that choice triggers the catastrophic feedback loop we talked about earlier. Let's trace the mechanics of this trap as the sources lay it out. Step 1. The welfare system incentivizes working-age people to drop out of the labor market, trapping generations in dependency.
Right.
Step 2. This creates a massive labor shortage in the real economy, while simultaneously creating a huge financial deficit because those people aren't paying income tax.
Exactly. And step 3 is the government's response to that self-inflicted crisis. Because they have a labor shortage and a tax deficit, the government decides to import hundreds of thousands of foreign workers to plug the hole.
But step 4 is where the system completely breaks, because importing all those people puts an immense, unmanageable strain on housing, roads, hospitals, and schools.
Yes.
To upgrade that infrastructure to handle the population surge, the government has to spend billions more. And to get those billions, they have to raise taxes on the shrinking pool of domestic workers in Tier 2.
Which leads right back to step 1. The higher taxes suppress wages and increase the cost of living, which pushes even more people to the margins, making welfare look like a more viable option.
Wow.
It is an accelerating death spiral of the productive economy. And the essayist uses an incredibly sharp, piercing phrase to describe this entire apparatus. They call it economic insanity dressed up as morality.
Economic insanity dressed up as morality. That phrase hits the nail on the head regarding the language the government uses.
It really does.
When politicians defend the expanding welfare state, they use the language of compassion. They talk about caring for the vulnerable and ensuring no one is left behind. But the text argues that this is a horrific distortion of the word compassion.
Right.
True compassion isn't locking 3 generations of a family into a cycle of state dependency in a decaying post-industrial town.
Right.
True compassion is a functioning economy with low taxes, cheap energy, and abundant jobs that incentivize human dignity and self-reliance.
The visual contrast the sources draw here is stark. You have the shrinking number of taxpayers on one side of the scale, bearing the entire weight of the state, and the ballooning welfare bill on the other.
It's an unsustainable physical reality.
It is, and this economic squeeze isn't just happening at the individual level in household budgets, it is happening at the macro-industrial level as well.
Which leads us to Section 5, where the sources explore the industrial constraints paralyzing the country, specifically regarding energy policy.
Right, because you cannot build Tony Blair's hyper-efficient AI reimagined state if you can't even turn the servers on.
Let's be real, you can't.
Points 3 and 5 of Blair's plan tackle this industrial reality head-on. Point 5 is a call to reindustrialize the north of England through targeted incentives, deregulation, and planning reform. He wants to cut the red tape that stops factories and data centers from being built.
But point 3 is the truly explosive intervention here.
Yes, it is.
Tony Blair advises the government to prioritize cheap energy over net zero targets in the short term, specifically advocating for the continued utilization of North Sea oil and gas.
This has to be the most embarrassing moment for the current Labour government in this entire saga.
Why do you say that?
Well, think about it. Tony Blair is a globalized progressive. He is the kind of figure who attends Davos, who talks endlessly about the global climate consensus, and yet he is looking at the economic reality of the UK and telling Keir Starmer, you have to abandon your strict net zero ideology because you are literally starving the country of the energy it needs to survive.
The author of the essay highlights this with a kind of grim satisfaction. The hypocrisy of the current energy policy is a massive driver of the populist anger.
Oh, absolutely.
The critique points out that domestic politicians are constantly lecturing the British public about sacrifice. They are telling ordinary people to install expensive, inefficient heat pumps, to stop driving their cars, to pay massive green levies on their electricity bills, and to accept a fundamental degradation in their standard of living in the name of saving the planet.
While at the exact same time, countries like China and India are building dozens of coal-fired power plants a year and burning whatever they please to supercharge their economic growth.
The essayist is pointing out the absolute mathematical futility of this. The UK produces roughly 1% of global emissions.
Right, a tiny fraction.
Even if the UK completely deindustrialized tomorrow, if everyone went back to living in caves and the emissions dropped to absolute zero, It wouldn't make a dent in global temperatures because the developing world would eclipse those savings in a matter of months.
It's the demand for localized, agonizing sacrifice for a negligible global impact that really breaks the public's tolerance. And the essayist contrasts this sacrifice with the behavior of the political elite pushing these policies.
The visual is just infuriating for the ordinary taxpayer. You have a family in the north of England shivering in their home because they can't afford to turn the heating on due to green energy taxes.
Yeah.
And on the news, they see the political elite flying around to COP climate conferences in private jets, surrounded by massive security motorcades of gas-guzzling SUVs, eating imported Wagyu beef, and lecturing the shivering family about their carbon footprint.
It is a level of hypocrisy that practically begs for a populist revolt.
But beyond the moral hypocrisy, the sources emphasize the hard, physical reality of energy dependency. This connects the energy debate directly back to the AI revolution that Blair is obsessed with.
Which is a huge point.
Why is it cheap, abundant energy so vital right now? Because artificial intelligence is the most energy-intensive technological leap in human history.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. People think of AI as just, software sitting in the cloud. But the cloud is physical.
Right, it's not magic.
The cloud is massive, sprawling data centers filled with thousands of servers that require astronomical amounts of electricity, not just to run the processors, but to constantly cool the building so the hardware doesn't literally melt.
You need massive, uninterrupted, 2047 baseload power. You simply cannot run a 21st century tech revolution on intermittent wind and solar power alone. When the wind stops blowing, your AI doesn't just pause, the entire system crashes.
Exactly. If you strangle your energy supply by shutting down North Sea oil and gas in the name of strict net zero targets, you are effectively opting out of the next industrial revolution.
You are legislating your own irrelevance.
Yes. Blair sees this clearly, which is why he is telling Starmer to pivot. He understands that you cannot power the future if you are deliberately crippling your ability to keep the lights on today.
And this brings us to the culmination of all these systemic failures. We've gone through the agonizing £54,000 cost of housing foreign criminals while ignoring local crime. We've unpacked the welfare trap that costs more than national defense. We've looked at the energy hypocrisy that strangles industrial growth.
It's a lot.
It is. All of these specific mechanical policy failures roll up into a much larger, much more dangerous crisis outlined in the final section of our sources.
Yes. Section 6 focuses on the ultimate result of this friction: the two-tier disconnect and the profound hardening of public anger.
Hardening.
Right. The text suggests that the sheer volume of these failures has created a fundamental language barrier between the government and the governed. It is as if they are speaking two entirely different dialects of reality.
Explain how the sources characterize this language barrier, because it's not just that they disagree, it's that they literally cannot communicate.
The career politicians, the Tier 1 blobs, speak the language of the modern communications state. They speak in focus group soundbites, ESG metrics, diversity targets, and abstract international obligations.
Right.
Their language is completely sanitized, designed primarily to avoid offending the media class rather than to solve actual physical problems.
Right.
They measure success by whether a policy announcement sounds good on a Sunday morning political talk show.
While the ordinary people, the Tier 2 taxpayers who are actually funding the entire circus, speak a language grounded in brutal physical reality.
Yes.
They speak the language of monthly bills that are outstripping wages. They speak the language of exorbitant rent, rising violent crime, crumbling high streets, and overcrowded doctors' waiting rooms.
They are speaking the language of a society in acute, measurable decline, because they are the ones physically living in the consequences of the policies the politicians design. This raises an important question about the mechanics of democracy. How long can a political bubble sustain itself when it is entirely insulated from the consequences of its own actions?
It's a terrifying question.
If the political class no longer even understands the language or the priorities of the people paying for the system, how can they possibly govern them with any legitimacy?
They can't. And that leads to the ultimate chilling warning the essayist delivers to Keir Starmer. The text points out that when a democratic government actively refuses to listen to lawful, rational public anger, when it dismisses £54,000 prisoner costs or impossible energy bills as just far-right extremism, that anger does not dissipate.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't just go away because a politician tells it to.
It hardens. That is the exact terminology used, and it is a profound concept.
Yeah.
The anger hardens.
Let's unpack what hardened anger actually looks like in a society. When anger is fluid, people protest, they write letters, they vote for the opposition party hoping for reform.
Fluid anger believes the system can still be fixed if the right people are put in charge.
Exactly. But hardened anger is apathy, withdrawal, and a total fundamental rejection of the system's legitimacy.
Hardened anger is when a taxpayer simply stops caring about the government's rules because they believe the government has broken the social contract.
Yeah.
When you call people extremists for worrying about their rent and their safety, they stop trying to reason with you. They stop listening to your media outlets. They stop believing your economic statistics. They just write the entire establishment off as a hostile entity.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to navigate the daily onslaught of political news? It points to a public that has completely run out of patience with the concept of managing decline.
Right.
The gap between the rulers and the ruled has become so unbridgeably vast that a highly critical, visceral essay relying on the technocratic talking points of Tony Blair is resonating perfectly in pubs, factories, and family kitchens across the country.
The fact that this essayist and Tony Blair are standing on the exact same side of the argument, pointing at the current government and saying, this machine is broken, is the ultimate canary in the coal mine.
It signals a complete breakdown of traditional political tribalism.
Yeah.
We are no longer looking at left versus right in the traditional sense.
No, we are looking at a battle between the speed and reality of the future versus the slow, paralyzing bureaucracy of a state that refuses to reform itself.
Let's briefly recap the massive journey of this deep dive. We started with the jarring reality of Tony Blair, the ultimate architect of the establishment, releasing a 10-point plan for a streamlined, AI-driven state that accidentally provided immense ammunition for populist critics of the government.
We explored the mechanics of the frustration, diving into the £54,000 a year cost of foreign criminals and the deeply cynical weaponization of the far-right label to silence taxpayers.
We unpacked the catastrophic feedback loop of a welfare system that costs more than national defense and the energy hypocrisy that demands the working class freeze while the elite fly private.
If you've been watching the news recently and wondering why the political rhetoric in the UK feels so incredibly heated, so persistently volatile right now, these sources provide a direct, unfiltered window into the mechanics of that sentiment.
They really do.
It is the deep-seated mathematical frustration of an electorate that feels it is being actively squeezed and managed into decline by a political class that views their basic concerns with contempt.
And that leaves us with a massive question to ponder, something that builds on the very first analogy we use today about software and hardware.
What's that?
Think about this as you go about your week. If Tony Blair is fundamentally right that the lightning-fast, highly disruptive artificial intelligence revolution is the defining challenge of our future.
And if the essayist is right that the current government is too bogged down in administrative bloat, consultants, and ideological fantasy to even fix potholes or deport criminals?
What happens when this slow, analog, failing political machine collides head-on with hyper-fast AI?
Will the sheer force of that technological collision force the state to radically adapt, shrink, and become efficient, as Blair hopes? Or will the bureaucracy simply shatter under the pressure, rendering the government completely, hopelessly obsolete to the citizens it supposedly serves?
You cannot run the software of the future on the broken hardware of the past. Eventually, the system has to crash, or it has to be completely rebuilt. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.